Welcome to Jay's Analysis. This is Jay Dyer. I'm the author of Esoteric Hollywood and the co-creator of Hollywood Decoded, TV show that streams on Gaia TV. Now, I've had probably at least 100 messages, tweets, comments, texts, emails about Jordan Peterson and would you interview Jordan Peterson? Will you debate Jordan Peterson? And first of all, for people who are very big name individuals, you can't just tell them, debate me. They have to kind of be aware of who you are. And, they're operating on a very busy schedule, when you're dealing with an audience of millions as opposed to, audience of 10 to 100,000. So the orders of magnitude makes it very busy. So the best way for those of you who want to hear me to debate anybody or to interview or whatever, the best method for that is for the listeners to actually message them, email them, and tweet them. And so what generally happens is that after a while, when people get enough of that message through, and this person or that person says, I remember that name, it's come up many times now, that ends up being the best way to get that kind of stuff to happen. Now, I think this year will be a good year for Jay's Analysis. We're going to expand quite a bit, I expect. We've got some pretty good speaking engagements, some philosophically and media-related conferences to come, and I think that will expand the audience, and hopefully some very big debates to come by a very big-name person in the next week or two if everything works out. So, I think that this will be a possibility. But as it is right now, it's very difficult to, get through. It would be like trying to, reach an A-list actor or something. Like it's not like will you tweet Mel Gibson and tell him to do a debate? I don't have Mel Gibson's, tweet information or whatever. And so it would be the same with Jordan Peterson. I know a person who knows him and has interviewed him. And I might could, reach out in that way. But I wanted to, I think, just to kind of initially give my criticisms of what I hear in the Jordan Peterson worldview. Now I want to lay out the pros first. I haven't listened to everything he's done. I've listened to, maybe 30 videos over the last couple years. So I want to lay out the pros first, and then I want to give some of my critiques and the con. I doubt he'll see this video, but maybe he will, and maybe this will, prompt a discussion or a debate or something like that. I don't know. This is not an attack. This is merely my critique as a philosopher, and as a philosopher coming from a religious perspective, religious philosopher, a critique of the positions that I hear him espousing. And again, I haven't heard all of his talks and lectures, so I could be wrong. Obviously it's irrational to ask me to listen to every single lecture that he's ever done before I offer a criticism. I'm listening to the very recent material that he's talked about, so hopefully this is not out of date, or, it's not my intention to misrepresent him. My first criticism, well, let me do the pros first. So he's very eloquent, very well-spoken. He's very precise, and I appreciate that. That's something that we try to strive for here as well, being very clear, very precise in the way that we frame things, what we're talking about, who specifically we're talking about, what we mean. Words are very important, especially in the Orthodox tradition when we talk about who God is, homoousios, right? Hypostasis, right? These various Greek terms that are used, in the New Testament, for example. So I'm all for being precise, and I appreciate that. He's very good at logically following through on a position and debating very well with the opponents that he deals with, most of whom have absolutely no respect or knowledge or reasoning skills whatsoever. So he's very patient, and he handles those situations very well. So I appreciate that. As I get older, I don't really have much patience for that kind of stuff. So, I was around that for many, many years in undergrad and grad school, dealing with this sort of social justice warrior type worldview in other students and in the professors. So he's good at that. That's all good stuff. The points that he makes on gender, I'm a little confused about, because I have heard him at times say that he's not going to refer to a trans person as the pronoun that they want to be called. And then I've heard him say that he's never said that. So, again, maybe I just watched videos that were clipped together about it or something. I don't know, but I think that it's very difficult to argue on the one hand that there's objective truth and that language matches up to objective realities and phenomena in the world, and then to turn around and say, well, but in the case of the rights of the individuals who want to be called something completely different, I'm going to respect their rights. That's preposterous. I'm not going to respect the rights, quote, of somebody who wants to be called a spider when they're not a spider. You're not going to force me to lie to accommodate your mental illness. It's just preposterous. So, in other words, we can't, on the one hand, argue that there's an objective realm where there's rights, natural rights, supposedly, right? And then turn around and try to concede the right of somebody to be completely nonsensical, completely irrational, to lie, and to say things that are not so. I mean, these two things don't work. You can't have both of these things at the same time. So that I don't understand. That was the first thing that kind of stood out to me as not very consistent, not very clear, not very precise. Again, if there's an objective world, an objective realm, then there's no right that an individual has to make that realm into something else that they want to be, just because they want to be called a spider or a fox or whatever trans species nonsense they want to be called. They want to be called a hot dog. They want to be called popcorn. I'm not going to call them a hot dog or popcorn just because they want to be that. But this is the illogical final result of the stupidity. I'm not calling Jordan Peterson stupid. He's a smart individual. But it's the stupidity of classical liberalism, which tries to seek for rights in something very ambiguous like nature. If, on the one hand, the highest pinnacle of your natural rights is an atomized individual, the individual, right, which is now in this classical liberal worldview, in the dialectic against collectivism, it says, oh, the Maoists, the collectivists, they put the identity group rights above the individual. We want to put the individual rights above the group. And what you end up with is, well, if the individual's preference for what he wants to be the case is ultimate in my view, then I have to concede that he has the right to declare himself popcorn. I mean, so in other words, he's trying to be consistent, and I appreciate that. This is what in philosophy sometimes is called epistemological self-consciousness, where a position works itself out to its logical conclusion. And sometimes we can have conflicting worldviews, conflicting presuppositions, and we go down one or the other route. So if we go with this classical liberalism route and we believe in all of these, quote, natural rights, and that the individual is the pinnacle, the atomized individual of the Enlightenment, that's the greatest thing that's ever happened. This is the greatest thing of Western civilization, and all this nonsense, which is not true. But this is the mythology that's, touted online. I would say that this dominates still in the internet sphere, in the YouTube sphere of the atheists and the libertarians and all this stuff. And again, okay, that's fine. You have maybe this phase where you go through this, but I would expect more, really, from Jordan Peterson, given his age and given his experience and the practical wisdom that he does have. I would expect a little more theoretical wisdom on the part of criticizing or questioning classical liberalism. So that brings me to my next point, is that the basis for the confusion in Jordan Peterson's worldview, as I understand it at least, I can be corrected, I'm fine with being corrected if I misunderstood him. The basic principle of the confusion that I see in his worldview centers around this notion of the pinnacle of the individual, and that's it. And that all group status, basically, let's put it in philosophical language, there's no ontological status to collective groupings. They're purely sociological constructs. Well, that's just simply not true. Now, he may not be going that far, but many in that position do go that far. So when he's arguing with a social justice warrior, he's really arguing on the same position of liberalism that they're on, right? I mean, if it's the individual that has the pinnacle of the right to be determining whatever they want to be that they think they are, then he has to concede that you can be called popcorn. That's my species is popcorn. My species is honeycomb. My species is sugar bear, right? I'm Pac-Man. It doesn't matter, whatever. The point is that it's nonsensical. It's a reductio, but it's a reductio because both of those positions, the social justice warrior and the position that Jordan Peterson is arguing for, is really two sides of the same coin. How did we get here? We got here from the dialectics post-Enlightenment. And the post-Enlightenment dialectics are basically Newtonian atomistic individualism. And so it's very arbitrary, but it's just as arbitrary to say that the collective is the pinnacle as it is to say that the individual is the pinnacle. On what basis? Since both of these positions operate from the standpoint of the presupposition that we don't start with the transcendent, we don't start with God, we don't start with any of that. We reason from these sort of materialistic, naturalistic bases. There's no way either of these positions is going to ever come up with anything other than being the dialectical opposite of the other. But guess what? Being a man, that's a real ontological union that I share that was determined from my birth. It's not something I get to pick. It's biologically determined. And it's the same with being a female. In other words, it's a collective grouping that's ontologically real, right? It's not a sociological construct any more than numbers are a sociological construct, any more than the existence of the external world is a sociological construct, any more than any abstract quality or quantity, whatever, is a sociological construct. They're not. And so this whole position begins with the assumption, that the false presupposition of nominalism. What is nominalism? Nominalism is the late medieval philosophical error that there are basically no universal categories, terms, genera, etc., etc. No universals. It argues that the only thing that's real, the only thing that exists, is material objects in some sort of classification or grouping around their what's called secondary qualities. So in other words, what is the tree? Well, the tree is just the thing that has the bark and is brown and is green, etc., etc. It's solid. It smells of oak or whatever tree it is, right? Those secondary qualities based on empirical data all collected together in a list, that is what that object is. But the problem with that naive empirical perspective, which is what all nominalists are empiricists, the problem with that view is that it reduces to absurdity. And this is what no one seems to grasp. And then when you actually start to grasp this is when you really break through to philosophy. This is when you really start to completely reorient your worldview and you understand that the real world, reality, is much closer to abstract concepts, we might say, in a way, right? Than it is to flux and uncertainty. Now, I'm not trying to degrade the world or the phenomenal changes in time and space as being illusory or anything like that. I'm not a Platonist. But what I'm saying is that it's more accurate to understand that logos as a personal principle that pervades the universe is actually the starting point and not the final concluding point. We don't reason through a bunch of earthworms and Pythagorean theorems, and then maybe we'll allow there to be some proof of logos. Now, it's in terms of order of argumentation, some people might go through that process, but there's a difference between logical order and ontological order. So in other words, something might be arrived at in a temporal sequence later, that actually has an ontological primacy. So a lot of times, and this is a big mistake that people make in apologetics, is that they confuse the conclusion of an argument with the actual ontological status of the argument. You see this in Thomism, where it says on the one hand that God's existence should be certain, but it also seems to say at other times that you can't know for certain that God exists, or if you can, it's only known through faith, or kind of a leap of faith in a way. And actually mathematical principles and self-evident maxims of philosophy and logic are more certain than God's existence. But if you really think about it, if God exists, then the maxims of logic and the maxims of philosophy are subordinate to him, both epistemologically and metaphysically, because he's the ultimate absolute principle in that worldview. So in other words, what I'm saying is that, and this is an error, by the way, that the Arians made. The Arians made this same error, St. Basil says, when they tried to show that Christ was not divine. Right? They were mistaking the ordo in the Trinity, the fact that the Father is first, and that because he's the arche, or the principle of the deity, who generates the Son and spirates the Spirit, that therefore that must mean, because of the ordering, that the Son is lesser and the Spirit is thus lesser than the Father and the Son. But that's not true, and Basil, is at great pains to prove that just because something is in a numerical sequence or in a posterior position, it does not necessitate or mean, or in any way is it determined to therefore be of some lesser ontological status. So how does this relate to Jordan Peterson? Precisely because the starting point of Jordan Peterson is classical liberalism, is empiricism, is all of the things that the social justice warrior starts with, and they don't even have to know these terms and the history behind this for that to be the case. And it is the case. I know. I've spent 20 years on this topic, so I know this. The first book I read on this topic 20 years ago was Rushdoony's One in the Many. Now, obviously, nowadays I have many disagreements with Rushdoony, and I kind of snicker looking back at Rushdoony. But that book is still worth reading. It's still on my recommended reading list 20 years later, because it introduced me to the basic ideas here of dialectics, and how powerful dialectics can be in terms of getting a grip on our minds and on our worldview without us even knowing it, until we are challenged to question those presuppositions. And I'm sure I have presuppositions that I still have not even questioned yet. Right? I mean, this is kind of a process that we go through in life. It's unavoidable. So nothing wrong with I'm not saying that you're bad if you're in the position of classical liberalism. I'm sure at one point, I think when I was 20, 19, 21, I had a basically classical liberal position. I didn't even know that. And by that, I'm not just talking about economics. I'm also talking about that paradigm which begins its worldview, its analysis, with empirical data, with the assumptions most of the time of naturalism and materialism, with a whole host of other assumptions that groupings are social constructs always at all times. I mean, really, when you flesh this out, it becomes more and more absurd. I mean, is the family a purely social construct? Well, the radical revolutionary tradition, out of the same revolution here, right? There's a right and a left-wing revolutionary tradition. The radical left-wing revolutionary tradition, Jacobins, communists, Marxists, Illuminists, they quite literally believe, yes, the family is also a social construct, because man is purely a blank slate. Right? So this is the presupposition of both sides of the Western revolutionary tradition that spread to Mao and the different Trotsky and all that. They all begin with the presuppositions of flux. There's a famous piece that Lenin has about perpetual revolution, and there's another essay that Mao has, a famous essay about perpetual flux. And so the idea is that there's just always perpetual change. And so their reasoning is that any thing that you predicate, this is why, by the way, we're actually at the point of arguing language, is because these people don't know it, they don't realize it because they haven't studied philosophy, but we're actually battling metaphysical questions. We're actually dealing with metaphysics and epistemology, things that everybody thought was dead, hundreds of years ago, post Kant, post Hume. We're actually arguing and debating these things again. They're back at the fore, but people don't actually know that they're arguing metaphysics. But to be able to predicate something of the world in the world, and to say that it has that identity and that it has that identity over time, these are classic philosophical questions and problems. Now, the problem of identity over time, which is a classical transcendental, I would say, is not something that you can prove empirically. You can't prove infallibly and empirically that an object in the world is exactly the same object a year, 10 years, 20 years later, because you would have to, strictly speaking, at all times basically be staring at this object. Now, this would be a very boring life to run this experiment, to stare at the book or a person, right? Because a person goes from being a baby to being a big person. Hopefully they don't turn into a big guy melded to the couch that's 800 pounds. Some people do, but is that the same person that was this tiny baby that's now like an 800 pound melded to the couch dude? Is it the same? Now, we think, yes, it's the same, because that's a common sense assumption. Nothing wrong with that common sense assumption. And obviously, in order to get along in the world, we have to make those kinds of common sense assumptions. But philosophically speaking, we can't, when we ask the question, well, how do we know that is the same person? How do we know that has identity over time? Because the cells have shed, right? The bones have grown and morphed and changed. It appears to be a completely different person, possibly 50 times larger if it's from the size of a baby to an 800-pound dude stuck in his trailer or stuck to his couch or bed. How do we know it's the same person? Well, we have this presupposition, this assumption of the self and of identity over time. Now, if we have a social justice warrior view, or if we have a Jordan Peterson worldview, strictly speaking, that guy can say he's not the same person. He can say, I am now Ham Planet. I identify as a Ham Planet. I identify as a moon. I identify as a Iapetus, as Io, right? Because I'm Titan now, because I have chosen this as a right. And for the social justice warrior, ultimately the Looney Tunes worldview there, they would have to admit that because everything is a social construct. There's no metaphysical qualities that bind us. Now, for the Jordan Peterson thought worldview, where do we go with this? Is this the same person? How do we know? I mean, we cannot empirically prove that that's actually the same. We can assume it, but can we empirically prove that it's the same dude from being this tiny baby to the 800-pound couch potato guy? The moon of Iapetus now? How do we prove that empirically? On what basis can we deny him his right to call himself a moon of Jupiter or Saturn? So once you make individual rights or collective rights in a classical liberal dialectic, and by the way, Maoism and all of the Eastern communism, that's part of the same classical liberal dialectic. It's from the same origins. They're all from the same thinkers. Where do you think they got their ideas? Where did the Illuminists get their ideas? The communists. It's the same train of thought. So, we're talking about metaphysics, even if we don't know it. We're talking about epistemology, even if we don't know it. We're talking about difficult areas in a way, whether we want that to be the subject of our focus or not. I mean, it just is the case, right? So the essence of this criticism is that Jordan Peterson is part of the classical liberal dialectic, and this might work for a stage to get people into a deeper stage, and it might work to make some good points here and there. But you notice when he actually argues with many of these wild leftists and these people on TV and whatnot, it's really he's basically constantly conceding the point. He's constantly conceding ground. It's almost like he's kind of working his way back into this little corner, painting himself into this corner, because he's constantly conceding the leftist point, right? Oh, well, women are exactly equal to men. No, they're not. Now, I mean, he'll say that they have different traits, but women and men are basically the same in this classical liberal dialectic. Women should have the go get it attitude to become a CEO. What? Now, I mean, maybe that works well for when, being on TV or whatever, and you have to speak to the masses of idiots out there. And maybe that's the only way to speak the language, is to speak classical liberalism's vomit speak, garbage speak. But look, we're never going to get anywhere just regurgitating the errors of the last 500 years, 600 years, 700 years. And that's why things don't change, is because you're always stuck in a dialectic. So the problem then, if I was debating Jordan Peterson, I would say, Jordan, I have a problem with your starting points with your presuppositions, because I don't see how, if I were to adopt the positions that you take, that I wouldn't just be a complete relativist. I mean, it's fine to critique these other positions, and you make good points within the little arguments that are going on here. That's fine. But when I hear this worldview, when I hear you respond to other people, you're arguing from the same left presuppositions. And until you attack, question, dig up the left Enlightenment presuppositions that you've got, that you started with, we're not getting anywhere. I mean, what's the point of creating a bunch of new Adam Smiths? Ugh. Right? I mean, do we want are we going to create Adam Smiths or Robespierres? Right? Jeffersons or Franklins? I mean, we don't want any of those people. Those people are the problem. They're the root of our issues today. So that's the main point, that has Jordan Peterson has he even considered that classical liberalism might not be true? I don't know. Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. The next thing I would point out is that he often wants to discuss empirical data, and that he's very good at that, and that's fine. And I don't reject empirical data, obviously. Humans are so constituted that they are empirical beings. But empiricism is a logical black hole. It's a self-defeating, nonsensical position that most of the modern world actually adheres to. Again, they don't even have to know it, but they tend to believe this. But it's actually quite absurd, super easy to refute. Again, we've done it. I mean, I've lost track of how many times I've criticized basic naive empiricism. Now, maybe Jordan Peterson doesn't believe naive empiricism. Maybe he's got some way that he thinks he can account for abstract concepts or abstract entities or numbers or something that's not nominalistic, that's not materialistic, that doesn't fall into that problem. I don't know. I've not heard really this question come up. But I also don't think that he's that philosophically fluent. And I'm not knocking him. I'm just saying that, he may have just gotten into these topics. I think I've heard him say at times through reading a lot of history and studying tyrannical dictatorships, and all that's fine. But, history isn't just history. History is also ideas. It's also worldviews. It's also men who have worldviews, putting their worldviews out there and changing the world. Men like Locke, like Kant, like Occam, like Hume, like Aquinas, like Plato, like Aristotle, right? So if we don't know the minds of these great men and these movements and how this stuff went down in history, then we're probably just falling into some kind of dialectic that's actually already been dealt with. And this is what's amazing. The arrogance of modernity, doesn't think that the ancients and our forefathers and these people actually had much wisdom and, we're so much smarter than them. No, actually, many of the things that are being dealt with have already been dealt with. It's just that most people are ignorant of that. When you go in a bookstore, when you take a college class, you don't read the church fathers. You don't have a real Bible class. Yet these are the texts that are formative for Western civilization. I can't tell you how many people I've met, educated, have no competence at all in the Bible. And I'm not being self-righteous. I'm not saying I'm better than them. I'm just saying that it's baffling to me that as an educated person, they have no knowledge of the texts whatsoever that were so formative for the last 2,000 years, not just the West, but also the world. That's baffling to me. Now, Jordan Peterson, as I understand, I haven't heard all the lectures, but I understand he has Bible talks that are Jungian. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to talk about myths in the Bible or archetypes or patterns. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But it has to be done from the perspective of the right theology. And so, hence, Orthodox, right? So we believe that our position is correct. So just being flat out, I would say that Jordan Peterson's position is not Orthodox. I understand from a person that, no, I don't know, again, if you create your own content, if you're writing books, if you're creating shows and whatnot, you don't have time usually to follow every single person in all their videos. So I'm not trying to be unfair to him. But as I understand, he was, I think, agnostic for a long time. And so hopefully if he is moving in the direction of theism, that's good. I welcome that. Most people who go down this kind of route of, maybe leftism isn't right, maybe I should look into libertarianism, and, then they start asking more philosophical questions. So there's a natural progression that we all kind of maybe go through, and it can happen at different points in our life. I'm not trying to say that makes me or anybody better or smarter or anything like that. Just kind of stating what I see as a fact, an observational fact. So if Jordan Peterson is, working out these ideas, then I applaud him. And certainly, I've changed my mind. I've been through different views and positions in my life as well. Nothing wrong with that. But we can, at the same time, for the purpose of, hopefully enlightening people, make criticisms that will, contribute to society as a whole, right? So these criticisms are, again, not against the person of Jordan Peterson, but against the just the problems that I have in this worldview as I understand it being espoused. And maybe he doesn't claim to have a fully coherent worldview. Maybe he's just kind of working his way through different positions and seeing which things work, and that's fine. I understand that, but I don't understand the approach to trying to solve these questions with empirical data, and then trying to find like psychological Jungian archetype analogies from the Bible, because Jungian archetypes are not empirical. Right. And again, I'm not saying Jordan Peterson is necessarily an empiricist. I doubt that he's that very fluent in the philosophical concepts. But I'm saying, how do we get from classical liberalism to Bible psychology archetypes? These things don't really work, except unless you've got some kind of like Masonic view. I guess if you're a Mason, then you think that the Bible is nothing but myths and symbols that are all the religions share, or something like that. Which is a fallacy, by the way. Which is like, just because something has a similarity to that thing, a genetic fallacy, doesn't mean it has the same origin. But that's a different topic. So and I'm not saying Jordan Peterson is a Mason. I don't have any knowledge of that. I'm just saying that it's fine to read the Bible through different lenses. If you take a college class on the Bible as literature, you're going to read things like Ecclesiastes and all that, and try to understand the mind of the author and that's fine. But the problem is that that's not all that the Bible says it is. So in other words, if we were to read a literary text, we would have to go with the text's own view of itself. So if we're honest with the Bible, we have to be honest with the way the Bible speaks about itself. If we view it as a coherent whole, and I would think that to argue that there's these Jungian archetypes in the Bible, we're assuming there's some kind of overarching themes in the Bible. So if there's any kind of unicity to the text, if there's any kind of holistic view that we want to attribute to the Bible, which by the way isn't empirical, then we have to be honest with the way that Scripture talks about itself. And I've done many talks on this. The Scripture says it's about itself, that it's inspired. Jesus says this about his own words, right? He says this about Moses. He says that Moses spoke in the Spirit. Moses spoke of him, prophesied him. So we can't, on the one hand, say that there's all this power in that text, if on the other hand we disbelieve all that and say that it's all added on by men and whatnot. Then the text it's a venture, an exercise in lying. I mean, why would you find a bunch of if the text is based on a bunch of lies, then it's not a bunch of wisdom. And so you're mining it for archetypes and Jungian symbols is just arbitrary, right? Or it actually is inspired. You listen to my Daniel talk, listen to my New Testament talk. We will have many more talks. Those are just two introductory examples. I'm not saying everything, it all hinges on those two talks. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that these are the things I would say to Jordan Peterson, since I don't know that there's ever going to be any debate or interview with Jordan Peterson, but so many people keep asking me about Jordan Peterson. I'm just giving, my criticisms as I understand him to be saying, as I understand him to be espousing in his worldview. So we've got this kind of conflicting sort of mishmash of psychological analysis of the Bible, and let's find some archetypes in the Bible, but I'm also going to be a classical liberal, and if I debate Ben Shapiro, I'm going to talk about how there's a kind of a God out there, but and again, God can use a broken stick, to lead people. He can use, faulty presuppositions and systems. The classical arguments are terrible for God's existence, but a lot of people have been converted through classical arguments. So, we're all fallible humans, and God can use those things to bring people to Him, despite, the bad presentations and bad arguments. But at the same time, we have a duty not to use bad arguments and not to use stupid, self-refuting things. So, I'm just not understand. In other words, my final conclusion would be that I don't hear a coherent worldview here. I hear a mishmash of an attempt to maintain modernity and postmodernity's liberal presuppositions, but spicing it up with some kind of traditional ideas. And this is a failed project. This is the never-ending failed project of post-Enlightenment conservatism. And it will always fail because it shares the same presuppositions of post-Enlightenment liberalism. So until those presuppositions are critiqued, and let's start with those presuppositions so we make it very clear for everybody. What's the three aspects of a worldview? Knowledge, metaphysics, and ethics. Okay? What are the presuppositions of the Enlightenment, classical, liberal, revolutionary epistemology? That the mind of man, through basic empiricism, discovers more or less all the truths that can be known. Now, some post-revolutionary people don't totally. There's nuance here, but just for the sake of argument, we're going to say, and again, it doesn't matter that there's some nuances there, because 99.9% of the people in modernity adopt these same presuppositions, and they don't know the nuances. So you don't have to try to one-up me in the comments and talk about some nuance of how Descartes, didn't believe in every single thing that Rousseau believed. I know that. The point is that the basic assumption of the modern world, post-Enlightenment and revolutionary period, is empiricism. It's the idea that we can only know what's immediately present to our experience through our senses. Man's a blank slate. This still dominates. This has been refuted many times over, 1,000 times over, by competent countless competent philosophers from analytical tradition, continental tradition. Doesn't matter. It just marches forward because it has money and power behind it, because it's a very useful, open society type society wrecking tool. That's why it's so powerful. It has the entire media behind it. So basic empiricism is the first thing that I would start in criticizing Jordan Peterson's worldview on. I would ask him, how does he know what he knows? How does he come to these positions? On what basis has he kind of ferreted out like his ideas of the Bible? How is it consistent with what the Bible says about itself? If the Bible says it's inspired, but you don't believe it's inspired, then is it not a lying, deceptive text? If it's just one text amongst many of this generic theism of generic God, what's the point of that? I mean, that's essentially another form of atheism, right? The content-less God that we can all just paste onto it whatever we want is no God. And that's really the deism of the Enlightenment, right? Metaphysics, again, I would question the presuppositions that he seems to espouse in the debates, where he wants to act like there are groupings and collective statuses, collective realities that are metaphysically real, that have an ontological status, right? Maleness, femininity, Western society, these things that are groupings. But he also wants to say that he doesn't want to go the route of total social construct. But sometimes he talks like it is social constructs. How does he know which things are the social constructs and which things are the real metaphysical unities that we have, right? Masculinity, human nature. And of course, this would then play into the questions of ethnos, right? And race, and how, that's problem area there, because we have to also deny that those things are real. But if you deny that those things are real, then how are you not on the social justice warrior tip admitting that gender is a social construct? So then lastly, ethically, I would wonder where he derives his ethic, because the different positions I've heard him take on different issues, I'm not really hearing a coherent position on why things are right and wrong beyond natural rights. And civic nationalism, natural rights is very easy to refute. On what basis do you know that XYZ is a right from, quote, nature? Where did you get this idea? Where do you derive it? Some other man told you this, a YouTube video, you read the Constitution, you read Rousseau. I mean, where do you get the social contract? I mean, any of that stuff is very easy to refute because it's circular, it's self-referencing. So we have no real notion or idea or clear presentation of what a right is in these worldviews. And why is that? Because they don't start with the transcendent. They don't start with theology. They start with naturalism. They start with empiricism. They start with the terrestrial plane, and you're never going to get a coherent presentation of what is right and wrong, what rights are, what a person is, what volition is, how there's free will, when you just have this isomorphically unified, total terrestrial plane perspective. And you don't allow for higher realities, higher planes of existence, God, spiritual realm, abstract concepts, immaterial objects, laws of logic, right and wrong, etc., etc. When you don't allow those conceptual, immaterial, invariant realities to exist, and I'm not saying he necessarily doesn't do that, but I'm saying when that doesn't come into your position, it's no wonder that you're all over the place, and we don't have any clear idea exactly what this ethic is. Like, there's no clear Jungian ethic that you kind of pick out of the Bible. I mean, do we go to war against the Canaanites? Is Jesus a giant hippie in this? I mean, it's nonsense. We have no idea, because it's just kind of like out of the mind of the dude reading the Bible. But see, in the Orthodox tradition, we already have 2,000 years built on the 4,000 years prior to that, right, of the Hebraic / Orthodox tradition. So I'm not saying that that makes our position right, but I'm saying that you have to account for truth and heritage and tradition having some connection to the past. You can't adopt the revolutionary tradition of wiping away all of the past and then trying to construct a metaphysic and an epistemology in some newfangled post-revolutionary, post-enlightenment way. It's not possible, because that position is built on wiping away the past, right? So Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Robespierre and Franklin and Jefferson and Adam Weishaupt all start with the same position of trying to wipe out the past. And so you're just following in the train of one of the flavors of these wackos. You gotta toss out these wackos first, because that's the problem. That's the root. And that's, of course, what nobody wants to do, because the whole world has adopted liberalism. That's what liberalism is. Okay? Liberalism is not Hillary Clinton in America versus Mitt Romney's Mormonism. That's nonsense. That's just a false Americanized dialectic. And I'm saying the false dialectic goes back even further, right, to the explicit rejection of the Orthodox tradition of the first millennium of the church. Now, we, in the Orthodox Church, we maintain that. We maintain the order, the structure, the belief, the unchanging eternal truths that we've espoused, not just from Moses and Isaiah, but up into the apostles and prophets. So we make a very radical claim. And all I'm saying is that you can get some truths, some aspects of things correct, but the position as a whole won't be and can't be coherent as long as it still operates on these atheistic presuppositions. And that's ultimately what it is, atheistic presuppositions. So a lot more could be said. Maybe if I listen to a lot more Jordan Peterson and I'll pick out some more things that I hear to be conflicting. But again, the basic critique is just that in the realms of ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, I don't hear a coherent worldview. I hear conflicting things, some of which are right, some of which are wrong. And I can already tell you that it's because the assumptions from which it derives, classical liberalism, have not been critiqued. That's what it amounts to. So maybe Jordan Peterson will have a discussion one day. I don't know. We'll have to explode Jay's analysis about 10 times bigger than it is before that'll ever happen, but who knows. So thank you for watching, and again, we should have some good debates coming up with Nick Fuentes, Orthodoxy versus Rome, and I might even have a big debate. I'm going to hold off on saying who, but very, very big name YouTuber may next week do a debate with Jay's analysis on theism. We'll just have to wait and see. But what we're going to do for subscribers this week is that even though this was a Jordan Peterson talk, we're going to continue this discussion of classical liberalism. And I'm going to pinpoint exactly where classical liberalism arose out of the West. And we're going to look at some of the figures like Gabriel Bile. We're going to look back to Occam. We're going to look at the nominalists. And we're going to see how that dialectic of the realists and the nominalists in the West. Now, I'm not saying the realists were right, totally. We can't adopt Platonism, but the nominalists are like so bad. They're the worst of the worst. And we're going to see how this ties directly to the mystical society known as the church. So we're going to be doing this fairly famous book by Dr. Sherrard, Church, Papacy, and Schism. It's not the best book on the topic, period. It's very good for its 100 pages, though. It's a short, easy treatise that people can read on this topic. It's not perfect, but it does hit the high points, and that's the main thing that we're going to go. So we're going to go through this book. We're going to pull out the main points and arguments, and we're going to see how the rise of the papacy in the Middle Ages coincides with a lot of these philosophical debates and issues. And we're going to see how we got to classical liberalism in direct connection with this stuff, with the Franks and the rise of the papacy and whatnot. So that will be in the second half of this talk for subscribers. Again, it may sound unrelated to Jordan Peterson and classical liberalism, but I assure you it is not unrelated. It is directly related because of dialectics, the crucial dialectics that we have to understand and avoid. 20 years ago, I was introduced to this topic when I read The One and the Many by Rushdoony. And 20 years later, I'm still captivated by this notion of dialectics and avoiding and overcoming dialectics. So we're going to see how in the church the dialectic occurs with the rise of the papal monarchy, and why this is always and still retains its problematic status for Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and how it went directly into influencing and causing modern liberalism. So thank you. You can hear the rest of this talk by subscribing at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. And you can also get my book, as you can see it back here, Esoteric Hollywood, signed copies at Jay's Analysis for $60. Outside the U.S., $30 inside the U.S. And you can subscribe to Gaia TV for my TV show there, Hollywood Decoded.